The neighbors finally had enough. The 6 people living right next door at 8763 Wonderland Avenue were just obnoxious. All they did was partying all the time. There was alcohol and drug abuse. They had loud arguments all the time. Things were thrown at the walls at any given day. It was just unbearable. And there was no talking to them either. Not to mention these shady characters walking in and out of this house every day and every night, even though it had been strangely quiet the last 24 hours. Nevertheless, it was time to find something else and move on. And the neighbors did. And so on the 1st of July, 1981, they hired a moving company. Now, one of these moving men, a man called Bruce Fisher, carefully carried one piece of furniture after the other down the stairs of this house, when suddenly he stopped in the middle of his motion, and he listened carefully. There was this crying and whimpering, barely hearable, directly behind the door of 8763 Wonderland Avenue. Suddenly, the door is pulled open, and 2 men come out of this house. They give Bruce a quick glance and then just walk past him down the stairs without saying one word. But then on the last step, one of these men suddenly turned around again, looked up to Bruce and said, quote, "There's dead people in there." He turned around again and left. And Bruce couldn't help himself. He just had to know what's going on. So he quietly and carefully opened the door of 8763 Wonderland Avenue, and between pills and drugs lying on the floor, leftover food, garbage, and destroyed furniture, he discovered the bloody and barely recognizable body of a woman. My name is Holly, and I welcome you to my podcast, The True Crime Cocktail Hour. This is case 2 of our video series, Investigators and Their Biggest Cases, Homicide Investigators Tom Lange and Robert Bob Souza versus the Wonderland Killings. We are in the 1980s in Los Angeles, just a stone's throw from Sunset Boulevard. And this is where the Wonderland Avenue is located. Los Angeles is a place of longing for many, many people. And it's the hometown of a lot of famous actors and actresses and musicians, just like Frank Zappa, the Beach Boys, or Neil Young. However, the area in the Santa Monica Mountains is also notorious. There's social inequality. There's crime, especially after the wave of cocaine and heroin that conquered the city in the late 1970s. And the narrow yellow house in the Wonderland Avenue plays a central role in this. The Wonderland gang consists of the following members. There is the head of the gang, Ronnie Laurios, and his wife, Susan Laurios. And then we also got Billy Deverell and his girlfriend, Joy Miller. And then there's David Lind and his girlfriend, Barbara Richardson. The members of the Wonderland gang are not only dealers, but also consumers, which makes them very dangerous and, what's more, very unpredictable. Their crime records are endless. Everything you can think of. Car theft, robbery, fraud, just everything. And there are a couple of unsolved murders that could be attributed to the Wonderland gang. A high number of addicts go in and out of the house every day, every night, one of them in particular, and also in very increasing frequency. The infamous porn star John Holmes. John Holmes was born in Ohio in 1944. Holmes and his stepfather never really got along very well, and after just another heated argument, John Holmes moved out, joined the US Army, and served 3 years in Germany. At the end of the 1970s, John Holmes moved back to the United States and to Los Angeles, apparently just because the weather was better. And you just kind of know, at this time in Los Angeles, the porn industry was booming. And John Holmes obviously needed to work, make some money. So he did a couple of movies here and there, and this would be the start of his career just skyrocketing. Porn producers loved John Holmes and always hired him for a special reason. John Holmes, in case you didn't know him, he was known for one thing and one thing only. John Holmes was very well endowed. In fact, his penis earned him the nickname 14-inch man, or in reference to Elvis Presley, King of Porn.
Do girls faint when they see this?
They don't actually faint to the point that they fall down and hit their head. Usually they just faint halfway, like falling to their knees.
And John Holmes at some point just went and had his penis insured for $14 million. $1 million for every inch. So long story short, even though he claimed that he made up to 2,000 movies and had slept with over 14,000 women, at the beginning of the 80s, John Holmes was broke, reckless, and a drug addict. But with the drug addiction came the erection problems, and with the erection problems came other problems, especially on set. Couple things. Either he couldn't get it up, or he just dozed off in the middle of making this movie, or he didn't show up at all on set because the night before had been a little bit longer again. And this is the start of a vicious circle that ended in the living room of the Wonderland gang in June 1981. So it's the 28th of June 1981. It's a warm Sunday evening in the Wonderland Avenue, and the Wonderland gang and John Holmes are sitting in the living room together, and things don't really look good. The drugs are gone, so is the money. Now don't get me wrong, John Holmes is not exactly a member of the Wonderland gang. They merely tolerate him, if at all. Ronnie, the head of the Wonderland gang, he hates John Holmes. He just doesn't trust him. Nevertheless, John shows up at their house almost every day because they are his dealers. John never has any money, so if he wants to have a little bit of these drugs, he, for example, has to strip naked in front of the entire crew, and then they make fun of him. And so over time, the king of porn turned into Mr. Donkey Dick. John Holmes was actually supposed to run an errand for the Wonderland gang, if you know what I'm saying, which he badly botched. And so now John Holmes owes them something. And one of the Wonderland gang's most hated competitors, so to speak, was the infamous drug lord Eddie Nash, and he happens to just live less than 2 miles away up in the San Fernando Valley. Up there in his luxurious mansion with the pool outside, and rumor has it that Eddie Nash is stashing piles of drugs, money, weapons, guns, antiques, and very valuable paintings in his house. Eddie's real name is actually Abdel Jarib Nasrallah. He gave himself the name Eddie Nash when he fled from Palestine to the United States in the 1950s. So once settled in the United States, he tried to work his way up, and he had numerous jobs. It was kind of like this typical story of the American dream. He had a hot dog stand, he got jobs as a stuntman, he owned some nightclubs, but of course, all of these things were just a facade for his actual business. So like I said, Eddie Nash is one of the top dogs in Los Angeles at the time, dealing cocaine and heroin big style. And all of this while using the nightclubs as a means for money laundering. Holmes not only gets his drugs from the Wonderland gang, but also from Eddie Nash. The two of them have known each other for years. As a matter of fact, Eddie calls Holmes a brother. Now, like always, Holmes never has any money. He actually owes Eddie a small fortune, but Nash doesn't really mind. He is just too happy to adorn himself with the 14-inch man. Now here's the deal with Eddie Nash. Eddie Nash is known to be a very loyal man, but he's also a man of honor. And once you gained his trust, he is your lifelong friend and absolutely loyal. But don't you ever mess with Eddie Nash. You don't get in his way at all. So whoever had the audacity to stand in his way or betray his trust will soon find himself buried somewhere in the desert with his teeth kicked out. And now his brother, John Holmes, is sitting in the living room of the Wonderland gang, one of his biggest competitors, planning a robbery on his ass. So the plan is, John Holmes is supposed to go up to Eddie's house and spend the night there, just hang out. And if the chance should present itself, sneak into the guest bedroom and open up the sliding door and leave it open for the Wonderland gang. Holmes is in on it right from the get-go. And this is just one of the things, Ronnie knows exactly why he doesn't like John Holmes. This guy would throw his mother under the bus for a quick nose. So John Holmes comes back from Eddie Nash's house and gives the gang the signal that the sliding door is open and they can start to operate. So Ronnie Laurios, Billy Deverell and David Lind get into a stolen Ford Granada and go up to Eddie's house. They also have their personal driver, a man called Tracy McCourt. Try to remember his name for a second. So Tracy is waiting outside in the car and Ronnie and the other two dress up as police officers. They have stolen police marks, it's just not a big deal. And they walk through the sliding door, armed up to their teeth, and pretend this is a police squad and everyone's arrested. Eddie is totally surprised by all of this, as is his bodyguard, a man called Gregory Dials. And before they can even react, both of them find themselves in handcuffs. So Ronnie, at this point, feels like a king. The notorious drug lord, his biggest competitor, Eddie Nash, sitting in front of him, all helpless and tied up with his revolver shoved in his mouth. And this is the point where Eddie realizes that this is not a police squad, that this is a robbery. Nash is sitting there, he's shitting his pants, he's begging for his life, while simultaneously trying to tell the gang where they find his secret safe and the combination for it. So Ronnie, Billy, and David, they take everything they can find. All of his drugs, his money, his guns, just everything. And they shove everything into a shower curtain and flee the crime scene. And they just leave Eddie Nash and his bodyguard behind, all tied up. Ronnie again feels like he's on top of the whole world. This robbery went on like a clockwork. Now, actually, his plan had been to just kill Eddie Nash and his bodyguard, but he had to promise Holmes that he wouldn't hurt anybody or kill anybody for that matter. That was Holmes' only condition. So back at the house, the loot is inspected and the money is counted, and the members of the Wonderland gang are quite happy with themselves. They also promised the driver, Tracy McCourt, and Holmes a little bit of money for their assistance in the robbery. And Holmes is quite disappointed when Ronnie just gives him a few ridiculous bills. Now, Holmes is not playing it smart exactly. He makes the mistake of complaining to Ronnie about the little bit of money that he got, and as a result, the gang just ended up beating him up and throwing him out of the house. Just 18 hours had passed since the robbery, and ever since Bruce Fisher heard the crying and whimpering behind the door and found the female body in there. And now there are dozens of police cars right in front of the house on the Wonderland Avenue. You can see one of the police officers setting up this do not cross tape. 4 bodies and 1 critically injured woman had been found in the house. Ronnie, Billy, Joy, and Barbara are dead. The only surviving victim is Ronnie's wife, Susan. But she's not expected to survive. Over the course of the attack, she had lost 4 pins of blood. The average human contains 10 pins of blood. All 4 victims had their skull smashed in with a metal pipe. Someone went absolutely berserk on them. And it seemed like the victims were surprised in their sleep. They find the head of the Wonderland gang on the first floor in the bedroom, lying in his bed. There weren't any defense wounds on his part. It seemed like he was just so intoxicated and so wasted that he had no chance to defend himself against his attackers. Now, his wife Susan, she was found lying on the floor right next to the bed, and she was still alive, but this is so unbelievably cruel. Get this. She had almost spent a whole day lying there with a smashed in skull. And like I said, there were addicts coming in and out of the house at every time of the day. And a whole number of addicts had walked through the house, saw the bodies, and instead of calling for help or calling anyone, they just collected all the drugs they could find and left the house. And they had noticed that Susan was still alive. She was crying, she was whimpering. She had asked anyone who was there for help. But they just climbed over her and her smashed-in skull. Barbara Richardson was found in the living room. She's the woman Bruce Fisher had discovered first. And she is so disfigured that she is barely recognizable. Her boyfriend, David Lind, for some reason, is nowhere to be found in the entire house. He's just gone, disappeared without a trace. Joy Miller was found in the bedroom on the upper floor, and she was hit the hardest. Her skull was flat behind her eyebrows. And Billy Deverell, her boyfriend, he appeared to be the only one who had fought back, but he as well had no chance against his attackers, and they found him sitting there, skull all smashed in and bloody, half leaning against a TV cabinet. This right here is homicide detective Tom Lange. He is a legend in his field. In case he might be familiar to you, he was also the lead investigator on the O.J. Simpson case. Tom Lange over here has investigated and solved over 100 murder cases over the course of his career. He's a detective of the so-called Homicide Special Unit, which is a unit that is only called upon high-profile cases, which are cases that require a lot of extensive investigation or a lot of traveling. And the Wonderland killings are such a case. His partner at the time is a man called Frank Tomlinson. But in the days prior to the Wonderland killings, it's been relatively quiet in the department. There was nothing much to do. And the 4th of July weekend was coming up, and so Frank Tomlinson decided to just take a couple of weeks off. For the time of his absence, another investigator was assigned to Tom, and that was investigator Robert Bob Souza. He worked alone ever since his partner got a promotion and went to work somewhere else. And Bob is also a legend in his field. He's a very experienced investigator, and he's also, he can be quite intimidating. He's quite tall, stocky. He kind of reminds me of Magnum. You know, he has the mustache and his boots, and yeah, I think he's quite the teddy bear, but I think you also do not want to mess with Robert Bob Souza. Now, Tom and Bob, they knew each other, but it was the first time they worked together. Bob's wife and children had gone on vacation over the holidays, and so Bob had the house and the pool to himself, and he just wanted to make the best of it. And so on Tuesday, before he went home, he went into Tom's office, and he said goodbye with the words, quote, "With our luck, we'll catch a XXX murder in the Hollywood Hills or something." Just a few hours later, Tom's phone rang, and 5 minutes later, Bob Souza's phone rang. Another case for them, as if they had just summoned it. Tom is the first to arrive at the crime scene, so is the media. You know, 80s and 70s, it was child's play to listen in on the police radio. Sousa was also on his way, but he was stuck in traffic. So Tom walks up the stairs to the Wonderland house, and he's met by a police officer who got to the scene first and discovered all the bodies. And this police officer is white as a sheet. And he described the scene to Tom in a very fitting way. He said, "It seemed like somebody had taken buckets of blood and spilled it everywhere." And that was really quite the fitting description. A little later, Bob also arrived at the crime scene, and he saw Tom sitting on the stairs with this look in his face that just told Bob, oh, we're gonna be here for quite some time. So he walks over to Tom and he says, "This isn't going to fuck up my 4th of July weekend, is it?" And Tom just stood up and he looked at Bob and he said, "It's gonna be a long night, Zeus." Whoever had gained access to this house with metal pipes caused a bloodbath. Everything that moved was hit, apparently. And there was one thing that was clear right from the get-go for both Tom and Bob. This was a personal motive, okay? This was not just another murder in the drug scene. This was personal. This was revenge. Listen to this. It takes 2 days for the crime scene to be videotaped, for the forensics to do their job and collect all the evidence, save it. It takes 2 days to ask all the witnesses and all the neighbors to see if anyone had heard or seen anything. 2 days in a house in the middle of summer, in a house with 4 bodies in it that had to be left lying around until everything was done. In a house without an open window, without air conditioning or a fucking fan. The very next day, the Wonderland killings are the headline in all of the newspaper. And Tom's and Bob's phone ring non-stop. And obviously, like it is in a lot of murder cases, there's also a lot of nonsense. But there was one phone call which aroused the investigators' curiosity. So on the other end of this phone line was a man who introduced himself to Tom as quote-unquote Fat Howard. And Fat Howard told the investigators that he had a friend with him called David Lind, who was a member of the Wonderland gang. He said that David was not at the house at the time of the murders because he was on his way to Sacramento because he had a hearing there, but he had heard about the massacre that took place, and he had read that there was a surviving victim, a woman, and he was sure that the surviving victim was his girlfriend, Barbara Richardson. So Tom and Bob, they make up this meeting with Fat Howard, and they agree to meet directly in front of the Wonderland house, and Fat Howard is supposed to bring his friend David Lind. So Bob and Tom get to the house, and they see Fat Howard right in front of the house sitting in his Cadillac Eldorado, but no David Lind in sight. The color drains from Tom's and Bob's face when Fat Howard got out and told the investigator that David Lind is already in the house. And Fat Howard, as I came in, I tried to stop him, but he's kind of headstrong. Tom and Bob just look up to the do not cross tape that is completely torn apart, and they just freeze. Okay, everyone who is involved with the Wonderland gang is a suspect at this time. And the last thing they need is somebody going into the house and possibly destroy any evidence the forensics and investigators had not yet found. So Bob and Tom, they draw their guns and they walk up the stairs. They listen, and there are sounds coming from within the house and a voice like somebody is looking for something. As it turned out though, their worries were completely unfounded because David Lind over here had very different priorities. So the investigators end up finding him in the kitchen, on the floor, on all fours, collecting pills like a squirrel looking for nuts. So Bob and Tom obviously want to talk to David Lind, see what he has to say. What does he know? But David is completely beside himself, especially when they tell him that Susan is the surviving victim and that his girlfriend Barbara Richardson was killed. David lost his shit, he grabbed into his pocket, he pulled out a full hand of pills, and he swallowed them in one go right in front of the investigators. Now, normally, the investigators were obligated to stop him from whatever he was doing, but Bob and Tom were just sitting there and they were thinking, let him have a go at it. Maybe the pills loosen his tongue a little bit. Can only be good for us. And to their defense, the pills did that very reliably. So David Lind tells the investigators about the robbery on Eddie Nash and his involvement in it. And he said that this quote-unquote porn punk, Holmes, probably told on them. I mean, the story was at least partly very consistent with the results of the investigation so far. So his story seemed believable. There's just two questions investigators still needed answer to. First of all, can they trust this drugged up addict? And second of all, what to do with David Lind from now on forward? I mean, yes, of course, Bob and Tom had more than enough to put him in jail. That way he would be there in case they decided they wanted to talk to him again. Then on the other hand, David Lind could consider that to be betrayal on their part and keep his mouth shut going forward. Now, they had also the option to just let him go. He could run away, yes. Even worse, he could also try to take revenge on Eddie Nash and in his juvenile recklessness probably end up as a new customer at the coroner's office himself. So after a little bit of back and forth, investigators just decided to let him go, let Fat Howard babysit him for a little while. But his statement, at least for now, is enough to storm Eddie's house. So they do that, and his bodyguard, Gregory Diles, opens fire on the police officers because he thinks it's another damn robbery. So Eddie Nash and Gregory Diles just sit there in handcuffs, being arrested, and Eddie Nash is so upset. He's furious, and he's like, why are you doing this to me? I'm a friend of the police. Let me just tell you, Tom and Bob should later find out how right he was. What was even more interesting, though, was that for the fact that Eddie Nash was allegedly robbed a couple of days ago, he had a lot of drugs and money in his possession. They do find quite a lot in Eddie Nash's house. Among other things, for example, they found confidential police documents. No one has any idea how they've gotten there, but what they can find is evidence for the murders. For some reason, Tom and Bob are also not allowed to question Eddie. They don't know why. Instructions from above. And maybe it's just a feeling, but Bob and Tom think to themselves, you know what, we encounter a lot of resistance within our own ranks. To make matters worse, Eddie pays his bail and is a free man again after just 24 hours. Tom and Bob have nothing but the testimony of a junkie, which every defense attorney would rip to shreds within a matter of seconds. But still, Tom and Bob felt like they were at least on the right path. Call it instinct if you want. But they need evidence. They need John Holmes. The investigators are able to locate John Holmes in a run-down motel in the San Fernando Valley. Ding dong, bitch, here we are. And Holmes obviously, just trying to talk his way out of it. And so he says that he knows who the murderers are. But in return for his testimony, he demanded police security for him and his 20-year-old girlfriend, Dawn Schiller, who was with him. Now, Tom and Bob agree. Still, they don't really think that Holmes will tell the truth, no matter what. I mean, they too have now realized that John Holmes over here has the backbone of a gummy bear. Now, Bob and Tom's plan, actually, was to take Holmes, bring him back to the police department, and get him to talk with the help of a prison cell and Bob's intimidation talents. However, at this time, there was this other investigator attributed to this case, and he was actually not supposed to investigate. He was merely there as an advisor, and his name was John Helvins. And John Helvins was also quite experienced, and he was like, no, that won't get him to talk. I've got a better idea. I think we can buy Holmes with gifts and a little bit of luxury treatment. And the head of the homicide department decided in favor of Helvin. And so within a matter of hours, John Holmes and his girlfriend were accommodated in a luxury hotel where they made use of the room service. They really allow themselves to be pampered. And even Holmes' separate wife, Sharon, joins the party. None of these three ever makes a statement, because Holmes suddenly wants a little bit more than police security. He also wants immunity, not be prosecuted for his crimes. And Tom and Bob agree again under the condition that Holmes is not involved in the murders and tells the truth. Holmes surprisingly confessed to letting the murderers into the house, but just because he was allegedly blackmailed to have his entire family killed. For some reason, he never, not even once, mentions the name Eddie Nash, and he allegedly also can't remember the names of the people he let into the house. Holmes' silence seems to be based on pure fear and not loyalty. But Bob and Tom are no idiots, and they still have a little bit of tricks left. And so they increase the pressure a little bit by telling Holmes that they found his handprint at the crime scene, right on the headboard of Ronnie's bed, as if someone had leaned on the headboard of the bed with one hand and had hit Ronnie with the other. Now Holmes is like, no, there's a good explanation. I slept in Ronnie's bed a lot of times, so this is where my handprint is coming from. All the people associated with the Wonderland gang tell the investigators, no, he did not sleep in Ronnie's bed, for sure. Ronnie hated John. He would never let him sleep in his bed. Holmes is clearly not telling the truth. And not only that, he also slowly turns from witness to suspect. I mean, John Holmes had betrayed Eddie Nash and had confessed to the robbery. Check. He had also confessed to the fact that he let the murderers into the house on the Wonderland Avenue. Check. They found his handprint right above a victim's head. Check. And then also his wife Sharon, she told investigators that on the day of the murders, John Holmes all of a sudden turned up at her house with blood-soaked clothes. Holmes, in the meantime, just bailed, but they were able to find him 5 months later in Miami, and he was put on trial for 4 counts of murder. Now still, Tom and Bob don't think that he's the murderer, and the defense team has quite an easy time on this case. But they still feel like maybe with the prospect of a life sentence, that will get Holmes to talk. But they were wrong. Holmes doesn't say one word during the entire trial. Perhaps this was also due to the fact that Eddie Nash sat in the back row as a spectator. What can I say? Holmes was acquitted. And Tom and Bob realized that they had to find a different way to finally get to Eddie Nash. They were back at square one, basically, unaware of the fact that there were internal investigations against the two of them in their own departments. So what happened, right? Tom and Bob, obviously, are not the only investigators investigating against Eddie Nash. There are also investigators in a whole lot of other departments, like the arson department, the fraud department, drug department, you name it. And all of them have something on Eddie Nash. And one of these investigators is a man called Henry Hoskins. If I remember correctly, I think he was in the drug, alcohol, and tobacco department, something of that sort. And so he was also investigating against Eddie Nash. And right at the beginning of the investigation of the Wonderland killings, Henry Hoskins went up to Bob and Tom and tried to squeeze out any information he could from these two investigators regarding their case, the murder, and Eddie's possible involvement in it. Rule number 1, as an investigator, keep your information to yourself, including colleagues. No exception. It's just about the integrity of your case. So Tom and Bob kept quiet, which Henry Hoskins resented, apparently very much. So he's thinking to himself, you know what, the fact that they don't want to tell me anything is one thing, but it's also strange that they haven't come up with any kind of evidence against Eddie Nash, even though they have been on this man for so damn long. So Henry Hoskins goes to the head of the homicide department and raises suspicions of corruption against Tom Lange and Bob Sousa, saying that Tom Lange and Bob Sousa must be on Eddie Nash's payroll as well. The investigation against Tom Lange and Bob Sousa lasts for a whole year, and the two of them are not allowed to investigate the Wonderland killings any further until the internal investigation is completed. And obviously the accusations turned out to be wrong. Duh. Neither Bob nor Tom ever heard any kind of apology. And it gets better. Now, after the internal investigation, Henry Hoskins quit his job for unknown reasons, and he opened up a private detective office. Interestingly, his business address is that of a nightclub that belongs to Eddie Nash. So 8 years have passed since the murders on the Wonderland Avenue, and you know, Tom and Bob have to get back at it again, and things don't look good for them. They won't get anything out of Holmes anymore. He died of AIDS in 1988. Susan Larios can't remember a goddamn thing about her attack and the murders. All the other witnesses they had were junkies and addicts with several own crime cases on their hand. Nash had relations to the police, probably reaching up all the way to the top. And obviously there were also other cases they had to investigate. Tom, for example, back then was investigating the Skid Row slasher, the serial killer Vaughan R. in Greenwood, and Sousa was investigating the case of the Hillside Stranglers, remember? But then, finally, 8 years later, a witness came into the picture Bob and Tom had waited for all this time. And this witness is Scott Thorson. At the age of 17, Scott was gay and fabulous and out there on the streets of the Sunset Boulevard, Los Angeles, and all of these nightclubs when he met his future lover, the famous entertainer Valentino Liberace. Now, the two of them become a couple, and Liberace, this guy is a whole different story. Very strange man. So 3 years into this relationship, he wanted Thorson to do plastic surgery so he could just look like Liberace, his lover, himself. Okay, 2 things on that. First of all, where's the red flag guy? You don't do that. Second of all, in order to be able to deal with the pain of this surgery, the surgeon gave Thorson a cocktail of cocaine and opium, something that Scott Thorson would never ever get away from. Eddie Nash is his drug dealer of choice, and he even becomes a kind of like a father figure to Scott Thorson, especially when Liberace dumped his ass a couple of years later. So Nash and Scott are very, very close. Scott hangs out at his house quite a lot. And when Nash went to prison for a little while, Scott even took over his business. Apparently not quite to Nash's satisfaction, because this is when the relationship became kind of fragile, and eventually Nash was released from prison. But Scott was arrested a little while later for, I don't know, something drug-related. And what do you know? When he was waiting in prison, waiting for someone to show up and rescue him and pay his bail, no one showed up. Eddie Nash had just dropped his ass. And Scott thought to himself, well, Eddie, if I'm going down, you are going down with me. So Scott Thorson turned up at Eddie's house on Monday afternoon. That was shortly after the robbery. And he comes into the house. Eddie's absolutely beside himself, saying that he was just robbed. And Eddie, is a lot of things. But he ain't stupid. And it just took him one day of thinking to figure out who these people were and how they got into his damn house. And he soon figured that Holmes, the sneaky bastard, probably left the sliding door open in the guest bedroom. Eddie obviously wants his stuff back, and so he sends out his people onto the street of Los Angeles to go find Holmes. And they do find him just after Holmes had been beaten up and thrown out by the Wonderland gang. And now Holmes is sitting at Eddie Nash's house, tied up, while his bodyguard, Gregory Dowles, is just working on him with punches. And Eddie just confronted him, saying, "Man, you are my brother. Why did you do this to me? Why did you betray me?" So Nash had figured it out. And normally, for Holmes, that would mean hello desert and bye-bye teeth. Not in this case, because Nash, first of all, wanted his stuff back. And second of all, wanted revenge. So Eddie reached into John's pocket and he found a little address book with all kinds of names, phone numbers, addresses on it. And he threatened Holmes to kill everyone he loved unless Holmes went back to Wonderland Avenue, got Eddie his stuff back. And Eddie was also like, "You know what? Just to make amends, you can also bring me the eyeballs of these robbers. And then we're even." So John was sitting there all tied up and he made a counter proposal. He said, "Okay, Eddie, listen. Yes, I did betray you. I will make amends, but not the way you like. So here's how it's gonna go. You go and summon your man, send them over to the Wonderland Avenue, and let them get your things back and take revenge if you want to. To make amends, I will do the same thing that I did during the robbery. I will open the door." So the next morning at 4 a.m., Eddie summoned his man. According to Scott, one of them was called Johnny, and the other one's name was not even mentioned once. And the two men grabbed Holmes, and they were on their way to the Wonderland Avenue. And while all of this is happening, Scott Thorson standing right next to it, listening to everything. The trial against Eddie Nash for 4 counts of murder began in 1989. His henchmen, however, were never identified. Now, Scott Thorson and David Lind were summoned as witnesses, as well as Tracy McCourt, remember, the driver? He had really turned his life around. He had a job, he was married, he was really doing good, and he had confessed to the robbery and his involvement in it, and by that also confirmed David Lind's story. So Bob and Tom were justifiably afraid that these junkies or ex-junkies were just not able to convince the jury. But turns out Scott Thorson and David Lind and Tracy McCourt are dream witnesses. They are sober, they are orderly, they do not get entangled in contradictions, and they master the cross-examinations of Eddie Nash's lawyers with flying colors. Everything looks like a guilty verdict. But then comes the surprise. The jury spokesman walked up to the judge and told him that 11 out of 12 jury members spoke out in favor of a guilty verdict. The 12th jury member, however, refused to make a decision. Now, this jury member was an 18-year-old woman called Chauncey Taylor. And this woman, she at least tried to explain why she couldn't decide or why she wouldn't decide. However, her explanation, whatever it was kind of far-fetched. And upon investigation, one found connections to Eddie Nash and a payment of $500,000 on her bank account. Now, the judge in this scenario had the choice to just replace this jury member due to bias. For this case, generally, there are 6 people waiting in line, so to speak. But he did not do that. For some reason, the judge just declared this trial a mistrial. So they had to do this whole trial again. The second trial took place in 1990. And again, it was a hung jury. They were not able to come down with a decision, meaning Eddie Nash would leave this courthouse as a free man. But then a few years later, the big surprise. Eddie Nash was again on trial for corruption and fraud and facing a very, very long prison sentence. Now, this is not the surprise. The surprise is that Eddie Nash wanted to make a deal to decrease his prison sentence, meaning he would have to make a statement about the Wonderland killings. So Eddie Nash agreed, and to everyone's surprise, he confessed. that he had indeed sent his man down to Wonderland Avenue to get his stuff back, of course. And that's all. He says he never told anybody to kill anybody. I mean, to be fair, Eddie Nash had spent quite the time in prison by that point, and being in prison just took a toll on him, especially physically. You know, the once so dangerous and feared and respected drug lord had become a fragile and sick old man. His empire was basically gone, and others had just taken over. So his statement was the first breakthrough in this case, and Tom and Bob, after all these years, finally saw a light at the end of this tunnel. Unfortunately, it was the 10th of September 2001, and less than 24 hours later, Eddie Nash, the Wonderland killings, and his statement were completely forgotten. 2 planes flew into the World Trade Center. The United States had other worries. No one should ever be convicted for the Wonderland killings. That was the case of Tom Lange and Bob Souser and their investigation into the Wonderland killings. Thank you so much for joining me today. I had a very nice time. I hope you did too. If you did, you can hit that subscribe button. If you haven't already, you can give this video a thumbs up, comment, let me know what you think about this case. It's always a very nice thing to see. I hope that we will see each other again in 2 weeks. And, you know, a little preview. The next case will take us to Spain, where we will get to know retired police officer Ignacio Carrasco and take a look at his biggest case. Until then, I hope you have a lovely weekend. Try to relax a little bit, and I see you in 2 weeks.